So hello, everyone. Welcome to this session on how to fight back if someone calls your political reporting into question. We are joined today by the wonderful Joy Mayer and Lynn Walsh of Trusting News. I'm Joe Amditis. I'm Associate Director of the Center for Cooperative Media, and we do these kinds of sessions all the time, mostly because these kinds of sessions are very important, and we'd like to make sure that our partners have access to the infinite knowledge and wisdom that come with all the other partners that we work with, especially folks like Trusting News. This election is obviously completely normal, nothing weird about it, never gonna, just a random, regular run-of-the-mill election. No, this is obviously an incredibly important and confusing election. There's so much going on right now, and there's a lot of issues being debated, and so we thought it was important to present this to you as you continue your coverage and trying to navigate the sort of tricky landscape that we all have to navigate as someone who is reporting on or covering these election issues. Without further ado, I guess I'll just turn it over to Joy and Lynn. Like I said before, I will go ahead and I will spotlight your videos. There we go. And you can take it away.
Great. Okay. Well, thanks everyone. Thanks for having us. I'm going to share my screen now here. Minimize that. Let me present here. Okay, so as was previously said, we are here with Trusting News, and we're going to talk about how to fight back when people discredit your political coverage. Just a little bit about both of us. I'm Lynn Walsh. I joined Trusting News about 3 years ago. Prior to that, I worked as an investigative journalist, primarily in local television. I'm based in San Diego. And Joy?
Hi guys, I'm Joy. I'm the director of Trusting News. I'm based in Sarasota, Florida, and my background is in newspapers, in design, and community engagement. And I taught at the Missouri School of Journalism for 12 years before starting Trusting News.
And so today, as we get started, we like to kind of always make sure people get kind of a view of where trust in news currently stands. So this is a poll done by Gallup every year, and they ask Americans, how much trust and confidence do you have in the mass media? And mass media would be newspapers, TV, radio. And as you can see, throughout the years, it's kind of ebbed and flowed. We hit the lowest point in 2016 at 32%. We have since gained some of that percentage back. And this graph shows the people who have said, I have a great deal or a fair amount of trust in mass media. And so that's what you're seeing here. So in 2016, 32% of people answered that question, saying that they had a great deal or a fair amount of trust in the media. That has now rebounded a little bit, and we're at 41%. And the reason that we show this is that we are all, if you're working at a TV news organization, if you're working at a newspaper, if you're working at a radio station, an online organization, you're part of this mass media that they're asking about. But just because you're a part of it doesn't mean that the way that people feel about mass media has to define how your audience sees you. And so that's what we want to talk about today at Trusting News. And something to keep in mind when we talk about this is to think about that not all journalism is good journalism. Excuse me. So when we think about that, remember, journalists shouldn't get automatic credit for being responsible, ethical, careful, and thorough. Just because you call yourself a journalist doesn't necessarily mean that you should automatically be trusted, right? And I think we all can say that, yes, we agree with that. We value skepticism. We want our audiences to read content that is good for them, that is accurate, and that unfortunately not everything out there that is kind of masking itself or being produced in the name of journalism hits that high standard. And so when we think about that, we have to say, okay, if our journalism does hit that good standard and we feel that we're producing fair, ethical, accurate reporting, how can we make ours stand out? Just another quick kind of some data points to share with you. This came from Pew Research Center in 2019, and it talks about journalists' role in society. And what they found is that 46% of people that were surveyed think that journalists rarely care about people like them. And then they also found that 54% of people surveyed think journalists admit or take responsibility for their mistakes little or none of the time. And so if you are looking at those figures and you're kind of thinking, okay, how should I be feeling about these figures? You might be very frustrated. I know when I see figures like this, I do get very frustrated that people have so little faith in the work that we try so hard, that we work so hard to produce. Maybe a part of you is determined. You want to try to change it, change the perception, show them that, no, there is good journalism out there, and here's how you can find it. Maybe also you're empathetic. I mean, I think, as we look at the information landscape that's out there, there's a lot of content being produced. And sometimes it's hard to navigate and find stuff that's credible and find stuff that is the reliable news information. So, not all news is responsible, right? So we can feel all these ways. People feel this way about the news. So what can we do to get them to trust in our individual coverage? And so if you look back at these statements, remember, some things done in the name of journalism don't serve the public, aren't accurate or fair. So how will people know that yours is accurate, that yours is fair, that you do work to cover all sides fairly? And so if you're thinking, well, I'm just going to keep producing good work, I'm just going to keep producing solid journalism, and that's it. Well, unfortunately, what we are learning at Trusting News is that having those good intentions and just producing that good content, that accurate content, ethical content, the fair journalism content, it doesn't lead to automatic trust. We have to do more than that. And so today we'll give you some tips on things that you can do. So a couple of things that you can do off the bat is talk about what makes your work trustworthy. The first thing when you're doing this, don't try to defend the whole industry. As we've talked about, there's some content out there that you probably don't want to defend. So defending the whole industry really isn't possible. It also wouldn't be accurate. So don't try to defend the whole industry. The goal here is to tell a story about what you do, about your mission, about how you work to be ethical, about what your ethical policies are, what your standards are, and explain and be transparent about the process behind the work that you and the people in your newsroom do. And remember, when you're telling these things and when you're talking to the audience about how you work to be fair, how you work to be accurate, and you're trying to explain to them your processes, think about just kind of what it means to trust someone. So first of all, when you trust someone, generally you trust people who maybe you have a relationship with, or that you've met, right? And when you think about that, trust involves both head and heart. And this is something that came from a Democracy Fund study in 2017. And what they looked at is that, there are different dimensions of trust and how people decide who to trust and what to trust. And some of them are affective dimensions, and some of them are cognitive. So those affective dimensions, they might deal more with, a bonding and identification, positive intentions, versus the cognitive might be that, oh, this person's reliable, this person is credible, this person has a trustworthy reputation. So sometimes as journalists, we focus on more of the cognitive with, the facts and the data, and we're always getting stuff accurate, but we can't forget also about the affective dimensions as well. And that sometimes people just being able to relate to you as a person can sometimes help build trust. And as I was talking about, when it comes to trust, when you think of probably people who you trust in your lives, there are probably people that you know or who have known for many years. And so a lot of this comes from knowing someone, having an interaction with someone. And so when we think about that, I think it's really important to share this piece of data from Pew Research Center. And the question that they asked the people that they polled was, have you ever spoken with a journalist? And 21% of those people surveyed said that they had. Only 21%. I know I was really surprised at how low that number is. And then not only that, but that number, the percentage of people who have said that they have ever spoken with a journalist, goes down the less white you are, the younger you are, the less educated you are, and the less money you make. So really important thing to think about as we are thinking about building trust. How are we reaching out to our audience? Because having people get to know us is an important aspect of building trust.
So we're going to talk about how what goes into responding effectively to people when your credibility is called into question. And I really invite you to think both about the content and the tone of what you want to say. So the content is kind of that cognitive trust piece. Like, what are the facts? What do you want people to know about your process, about your ethics, about the goals behind your work, about the decisions you make? about the people behind the work. You know, what are the facts? The tone of how you respond is more that effective trust. Think about the basics of customer service. Think about what it looks like to feel heard. Think about what makes you feel connected, what makes you understand the intentions behind work. So when we talk about the ways that we respond, it's really important to think about not getting defensive, but being ready to explain and defend your work in a way that is likely to make people feel connected to you and to make people want to believe you. So when we talk about having humility and what goes into a proper response, let's look at one example. It's really important that we talk about that we respond in a way that validates that people are frustrated. I love how one of our newsroom partners here, Mike Cannon at WCPO, says, you know, there certainly is a lot of partisan information out there. Have some empathy that it is hard for people to navigate the news. And then say, you know, if you have specific stories you thought were unfair, please, I would love to hear from you. Here's what we do. But our goal is never to divide people. Our goal is to bring about healthy conversation. It matters a lot to validate people's confusing experiences and to show people that you talk publicly about your goals for your coverage and sort of why you do this. So that it means you have to start by reading comments, which I think there's sort of a perception in journalism, sort of an accepted practice that maybe it's not even good to do that, right? Like, don't read the comments. I feel like people have t-shirts that say don't read the comments. The challenge behind that is that a lot of really valuable feedback comes in comments if you know how to look at them, and we're going to talk about sort of how to parse them, how to think about comments in a way that's more useful and fruitful and productive. But when people comment, they are making a public statement about your work, either about the content of what you're covering or about you and your integrity. And so the challenge we have, the opportunity we have in comments is to respond in a way that talks not just to the person making the comment, but to everyone else who's reading. So I invite you to think about, when we think about comment moderation, my favorite way to look at it is to think about comments as a party you're hosting. So imagine if you hosted a physical party in your house and you stocked the bar and put out food and turned on the music and threw open the doors and then left. Invited anyone they want to come inside and hope that they're on their best behavior. Hope they don't trash anything. Hope they're nice to each other. Hope they clean up after themselves. Hope that goes well. So that's kind of the approach that a lot of journalists take to their comments. And if we're talking about comments on your website, on your Facebook page, these are conversations that you are hosting. And we just need to take some ownership over that and protect the experience of the people in the room. So when you're hosting a party, if somebody gets unruly, if somebody gets rude, you have a series of things you do as the host, right? You might redirect them to another conversation. You might sort of challenge them. You might brew them a cup of coffee, and eventually you kick them out, because you don't want to let one jerk ruin the party. So if people are ruining the experience of your comment section, it's up to you to do something about that. Also, if one jerk is ruining the experience of your party, that reflects on you, right? Other people are going to leave with a bad impression. They will have had a bad experience. So it's in our best interest to protect sort of the integrity of the comment section, to defend ourselves when people attack our credibility, to defend, to step in when people are being awful to each other, and to take some ownership over that. So a good first step that we recommend is to have a comment policy that empowers you to step in. A comment policy that says, here's the kind of conversation we welcome, here's what is not allowed. And when you delete comments, when you ban people from participating, that is showing respect to everyone who's following the rules. So I'm a big fan of linking liberally to your comment policy, being consistent. When you link, you're showing people that you have a policy, that you're making decisions carefully and consistently with their best interest in mind. So I like to leave comments like, we know you value civility and we do too. That's why we have deleted comments that violate our policy, which you can find here. Thank you to those of you who are following the rules. And you can do that over and over and over, and people get the idea that you're paying attention and that you're there. So once you are there, think about what you want to say. We talk a lot at Trusting News about having a counter narrative. If people attack you and say you're unfair, what is your counter narrative? If people accuse you of having a political agenda or partisan bias behind your coverage, what is it you wish them to know? which they knew. If they accuse you of not being careful with facts, or of covering one thing but not another thing, or if they're mad about why you have a paywall and they assume it's because you're greedy and you just want to make a lot of money, what is the counter narrative? And be ready to jump in and defend yourselves and explain what makes your work credible. So we have examples here we're going to show you, and Lynn and I are just going to talk you through some things that we've seen. A lot of these are from the newsrooms that we partner with and sort of coach, and some of them are just things we found that we really appreciate, but that are examples of what it looks like to participate in comments and why that can be worth your time. So this first one came from WCPO, which is a TV station in Cincinnati that we work with a lot. And Mike Cannon, the news director, was doing a sort of an AMA style post where he said, we want to be worthy of your trust. How could we do better? What questions do you have about how we operate? And this is one thread that that is a theme we've seen before. Somebody saying journalists are not credible on how they cover firearms. They get some basic things wrong. And Mike jumps in once and says, this is great feedback, thank you. He gets in again and says, if either of you know any great experts to use, feel free to email me. And the next day, Mike forwarded to me an email thread with one of these gentlemen that basically where one was saying, I do know people, like I have a buddy who runs a gun shop, but he's not going to talk to you because you guys get this stuff wrong. And they went back and forth a couple times, but it ended up with the viewer having said, well, I talked to my friend and he's willing to help you out. And we have had some newsrooms make some real strides around, teaching their newsrooms sort of the basics of covering firearms. And in this case, taking the time to respond to a comment that was critical and ask for more specific information and do that offline, move it to email, actually led to a really important source and to showing some critical community members that you do care about getting it right.
And this next example, this is from The Day, another newsroom partners of ours, and they were getting feedback after they published a story. And so in response to the feedback, they basically came out and said, The Day is going to match its reporting on military and on veterans with any newspaper in the country. It is extensive, but we cannot cover every event. They talk about how the focus of this particular story was on the protesters and the ongoing debate as to whether the statute of limitations on bringing lawsuits for the alleged sexual assault of minors should be charged. They said, however, we respect the rights of our readers to offer their opinions, including, as in this case, in letters to the editor. So what they were doing here is saying, like, we see that we are being criticized, and we are looking at your criticism, but we stand by our reporting, and here's why. And then they give kind of a little bit of an explanation that kind of goes to the complaints, talking about how they can't cover every event.
This is one that I find really interesting because it's something that journalists would just absolutely take for granted, but we have to remember that the way we make decisions are invisible unless we talk about them. So here's one where a reader was saying, this is a newspaper, the Milton Independent, that was covering a contested Democratic primary, and there was a Republican primary that wasn't as contested of a race, and so they were putting their attention mostly on the hotly contested race. And so somebody said, are you interviewing Republican candidates as well? And if you look down to the fourth reply there, the newspaper says, because of our limited resources, we had to focus our attention on the most competitive race. Please be assured that we will speak with candidates from both parties before the November election. And here's how you can submit more questions or feedback. And I appreciate that. One of the most common questions we see from the public is that they want to know how people decide what news is. That agenda setting function. How do you decide what to cover? And journalists don't actually talk that much about that. We have sort of there's a lot that's unsaid even in the newsroom about what makes something news. And honestly, there's a lot about what makes something news that is kind of hard to explain or defend, like which editor's on duty and what did we cover last year and we're bored with it this year. There's a lot that is not super consistent. And so when it matters a lot like this, and we do have a legitimate reason behind something, I think we need to make sure to make that visible so that people understand we're thinking about it and they don't have to agree with the decision. And also reminding people that we have limited resources is important, because I don't think that's something most folks think too much about.
This next example is from PolitiFact, and they shared a link to a fact checking related to Nancy Pelosi. And then they decided to be proactive and basically leave the first comment there on Facebook when they shared it. And what they said was, they basically explained that they go out of their way to seek varying polls with different points of funding, so that we can consider every angle. And then they linked to basically more information on their sources, and which then if someone clicked, it talks about more information about how they choose which polls to follow, what information they use to do fact checking. So this is an example of kind of knowing your audience and maybe knowing that, okay, we're about to share something. People we come in from one side or the other, from the right or the left, and kind of be critical. So, we're going to get ahead of it and actually kind of before that kind of state, here's how we did this and here's where you can get more information.
This is a funny example from WCPO. Funny. It didn't seem funny to them at the time, but it's funny looking at it from a journalist perspective because it's so incredibly frustrating. When WCPO was asking for feedback and questions from viewers, somebody said, how do you determine your stories to be run? Are they straight off the AP, or do you fact check them first before you throw them out there, right? Super volatile language. So Mike said, we don't have the ability to fact check stories that come from our news partners. We look to the AP for national or international stories. I hope that helps explain. Well, it didn't. Janet is not at all satisfied. And she said, well, that explains a lot, how you just throw things out there. You have no real journalists. You just follow the sheep, like super accusatory language. What we advise newsrooms to do is see if you can breathe and strip away the accusations and figure out what people actually don't understand. And in this case, Janet does not understand the role of Associated Press content. And we find this a lot, that people don't know if you work for an NBC station that you don't control the Today Show. And that if you work for, if you run any sort of wire content, it's important for journalists to remember that they are responsible as the vehicle for people finding that, but people don't know that you don't do that individually. So of course it would be mass chaos if every local newsroom tried to independently fact check stories from the AP, right? That's not how that works. So Mike gets back in and says, we fact check local stories. We rely on AP for these. We have an entire team of hardworking real journalists. We cover local news. So Janet might not be persuadable. It might be that nothing the newsroom says back is going to convince her that they shouldn't fact check AP stories themselves. That's okay. There are a lot of people reading this thread, hundreds, thousands perhaps of people reading this thread who are not Janet. And maybe had never really thought about where AP stories come from. Maybe are likely to be swept along by Janet's persuasive argument, but actually have an open mind toward Mike's persuasive argument. So this is a case where letting Janet have the last word would be a mistake. Not responding leaves this as the record. You probably don't even fact check AP stories, right? And if we choose to get in there, then the public conversation around our work includes our counter narrative or our rebuttal.
In this next example, this is also from PolitiFact, and it basically, when the conventions were happening for both the Democrats and the Republicans, they were getting questions from their readers about, where is your fact checking of the Democrats? And that they seem to check Republicans more than Democrats. And the question is then, are you biased? Because that's how it appeared to some of the readers and their users. And so they decided to address those questions head on. And they explained, the question, where is your fact checking on the Democrats? It's right here. And they said, last week their team worked nights to fact check the Democratic National Convention. This week it's the Republicans. They talked about how they're independent, nonpartisan fact checkers, and they're committed to fact checking both parties. And then they also, what I really, really love is they offered, they said, if you see something we haven't fact checked from either side that you think we should, please send me an email. And that then they, also said we fact check many reader suggestions every week. So just asking for that feedback if you have a suggestion, and then how they act on the feedback that they get. And then with the question of, seems like you're fact checking Republicans more than Democrats, and that makes you biased. They basically said they're not trying to make either party or particular politician look bad or look good. They really are fact checking to inform readers, and that they work hard to hold everyone accountable to the same set of standards. What they talk about, and they've done a video on this that explains how they choose what to fact check, but they say, we do tend to fact check provocative statements that sound wrong. So if some people get fact checked more, that could be why. And then again, they ask for feedback. Again, if you hear something we haven't fact checked that you think we should, please email me.
I love when journalists just address it head on that way. Don't dance around it. Just say, yeah, like we've provocative statements that sound wrong. Those should get fact checked, right? That's using sort of neutral language to describe their process in a way that can help people understand. This is another example of doing that. This is from a newsletter from ProPublica talking about how they cover this administration and what makes it different. And it says, while we've covered them with similar rigor, we've published many more stories critical of Donald Trump than we did of Barack Obama. Here's why. Let's look at some of the facts around this administration. The unique presidency of Donald Trump is no reason to suspend accountability or accountability journalism for political opponents. But no previous president has ever insisted on profiting personally. So this newsletter discusses how they actually wish that there were more sort of political diversity among their audience, and recognizing that at ProPublica they probably reach more people who lean progressive, but discussing what their sort of approach to covering it. I think that as an industry, we're not ready. We are not showing that we're ready to discuss really the lack of political diversity of thought in our newsrooms. And sometimes when people are accusing us of bias, it does mean that we should take a closer look at ourselves and also be more honest around around where we might have blind spots, and invite our audiences to weigh in on that.
So this example is, we're going to have a couple examples about how to respond to misinformation accusations. If you haven't gotten any yet, I'm sure maybe they will come here as COVID and the election as COVID continues and the election picks up even more. But this is from the Milwaukee Journal Sentinel, and when there were protesters out, and there were two gentlemen that were dressed wearing similar clothing. One was holding a Confederate flag, and when the Milwaukee Journal Sentinel used that image, people got to Facebook and said, no way, this is an altered image. Here's this guy, and he doesn't have a Confederate flag in his hand. And they basically then wrote, here's what happened. And they used video to kind of show there were two people wearing similar content. One had the Confederate flag. One was holding a "Don't Tread on Me" flag a few feet away. And so people might have saw photos that just had the gentleman with the "Don't Tread on Me" flag. Someone else might have just seen the person holding the Confederate flag. And so then they see the picture with the Confederate flag and they're like, wait a second, that's not what I saw. So they addressed it head on, and they talked about it. And then I also like that they used images and video to kind of show, here are these two people. This is real. This is what happened.
You can let the public, besmirch your credibility and say, you altered this. And if it's just like a fringe thing and it's not getting too much attention, the right answer might be to ignore it, or leave a comment there and say, no, we wouldn't do that. But especially as rumors about your work pick up steam, it's so important to be on the record as saying that there might be people who would do this. We are not one of them. That would violate our photojournalism ethics and our brand ethics. Here we go. So it can be really powerful to make a statement saying, we are on the side of facts and we will stand up against misinformation. So that's what our partners at the Coloradoan did here in a Facebook group they were moderating. And this was during the earlier days of COVID. And they said, they just wanted to make it clear to people, we're going to remove posts that are speculation. That's not what we're here to do. That can actually, add to public panic and hysteria. So if you have something you'd like to share, feel free to send us a message. But we wanted to make sure you understand that this is a place you can come and believe what you see.
This next example comes from a TV journalist in Jacksonville. And we've seen, I feel like in COVID, and then I think, with the example with the Confederate flag, a lot of people and users questioning photos and angles of where your photo is taken, and questioning the authenticity of your photos based on maybe what they might be seeing on social from friends or family. And so this is another example of that, where when the beaches kind of just started reopening in Florida, people were talking about how they were so crowded, but then other people were like, no, it's not crowded at all. You're just exaggerating it, and you're just focusing in or zooming in on the parts that are crowded. So this journalist basically talked about how, look, this is where I was on this day, and here are all the different perspectives. And he used images to show it of what I saw. So one shows an image, taken from an iPhone. Another is something that was taken from the chopper. Another is from a different angle with a different type of camera, right? Kind of zoomed out. And so explaining all of that kind of shows, okay, no, we are not trying to, we're trying to use images that best portray what exists. But do know that everything else you might seeing might depend on the perspective or what they are using or zooming in on. So to keep that in mind. So I think talking about that and how we choose which images is something that I haven't seen a lot of journalists talk about, but I have seen more and more users wanting to know that. So I'm just thinking about election lines, right? Or people waiting in line to vote. I can just imagine some of the questions that might pop up or kind of some of the things people might say, not believing it because maybe at their polling place there wasn't a line, but you're showing a line 2 hours later that's like out the door. So some things to think about when you're choosing images, and then how to talk about how and why you chose which images to use.
If your audience doesn't have a story in their head about why you do something, they'll make one up and it won't be flattering. So if you don't explain to them where you were, if they're not convinced that you were at a polling place this afternoon and here's what it looked like, the story they have in their head is going to be that you picked the one where there was the biggest line or something, right? It is worthwhile to track when content matters a lot to you, when public conversation around your work matters, it is important to correct the record. And sometimes that can involve following where your content moves. So this is a Colorado Public Radio reporter I was working with, and he noticed that he had done a story about public art in Denver, and he noticed that this this page had shared his story, but when they shared it, they got something wrong. When they said Colorado taxpayers pay for this junk. And so he actually left the first comment and used it as both a fact-checking opportunity and an engagement opportunity, and said, one point of clarification, taxpayer dollars were not used for this particular public art. They're not at the airport. But I am working on more stories about public art in Colorado, and I would love to hear from you about what you think about that. So it can be really worthwhile to sort of join conversations about your work, and make sure that people are understanding the content correctly, and then also invite their questions and input on future coverage.
And I think, again, Joy mentioned this, but it is about kind of correcting the record too. And I know we may not have time to correct everything that might be misspoken or misstated about our work, but remember, it's not just responding to that one person. I mean, think of who knows how many followers this Colorado Union of Taxpayers have, and then who saw what they said, Colorado taxpayers pay for this junk, when in reality, that actually is not the case. So that's inaccurate information. So you're doing a service to the information landscape that people are consuming, as well as defending your work. You're letting people know that, hey, actually, here is the truth, which I think is super helpful in a role that journalists should play. So when we think about these comments and the feedback that you typically receive, and Joy started hinting on this a little bit, you do want to look for patterns. Are there things that you are seeing? So maybe you get tons and tons of comments and you're like, we can't respond to everything, which is totally realistic in a lot of cases. Maybe think, okay, can we respond? Are we seeing a theme in some of these comments? And maybe that's what we should respond to. Maybe people really have a lot of questions about, why you chose to reveal one person's name in the story, but maybe not another. Maybe they have questions about why you chose to cover this story in the first place. And maybe those are the things that you decide to focus in on and answer. So again, you may not be able to get to all of them, but can you think about, when you're thinking about the feedback in the comments, look for patterns, and then respond to those with the patterns or what most people are saying. But then also think, let's decide what I wish people knew about this story. And so what we like to think of it is you're turning assumptions into information gaps. So, if someone says, oh, you have a bias against President Trump because I saw that your paper endorsed Joe Biden, and then that bias is leading you to only cover negative stories about President Trump. Maybe people say your newspaper is one-sided because it covers stories about legislation focused on minority groups, homelessness, and police accountability. Or, hey, you're airing these political rallies and speeches because you're just making so much money from it and you just love having them on. Or they just say, the news organization, you want Democrats to win because you're just part of that liberal media. So these are kind of assumptions or criticisms or complaints that may pop up. And so the idea is, how, when we respond, can we turn them into information gaps to then explain how these things work? So with the accusation of, hey, your newspaper endorsed Joe Biden, that means you're biased. Well, you can talk about how opinion, content, and endorsements are separate from and do not influence news coverage decisions. And if someone says, oh, you only are ever covering bad stories about President Trump, You can say, look, we don't look at stories as negative or positive toward a candidate. We cover what is happening and how people respond to what is happening. And that goes for all candidates. If people complain that, oh, you have an agenda to try to defund police, that's why you're covering all this legislation based on it, or all the lawmakers talking about this, you can say, no, we actually cover legislation so you know what rules and regulations might be changing. We're covering what is being presented at the legislature. Do talk about your funding. How do you make money? Are you making money from advertisements? Are you funded by donations? And then do ratings influence that by any by any terms? And I think a lot of people do have a lot of questions about, political ads. Why do you run them? Do you fact check them? Do you have any kind of involvement in that? And I think that's really important to explain. And then the other thing, if people say it's just the liberal media. Well, talk about how you leave your political beliefs out of the newsroom. And as a group, you work to hold one another accountable to be fair when covering candidates and issues.
So we want to talk you through a few examples, and then thanks for the questions that are showing up in the chat. We will get to those in just a few minutes. We want to talk you through a few examples of how you can be proactive around these things. What we've shown you so far is pretty much responding to what you are hearing from your audience, responding in a comment, into like addressing a criticism when it comes in or a question when it comes in. What we find with the newsrooms we work with is that as they develop that muscle of listening to the feedback, reading the comments, turning that feedback into information gaps, then once you have that list of information gaps, you're like, oh, people don't understand which polls we trust. People don't understand how we decide what to cover. People don't understand how we work to be fair. Then you think, what does it look like to build some proactivity into our processes and our products so that we can help people understand? So we've been doing a lot of work with the San Francisco Chronicle, and one thing they're working on is injecting kind of behind the scenes boxes, behind the story boxes into the middle of their story. So this is a story about Rudy Giuliani. This box shows up in the middle. They can put it anywhere. Their CMS lets them put it anywhere in a story they want, and it shows up collapsed with just the first few lines showing, and then people can expand it. So it's a box saying, this reporter began looking into this issue in 2017. He requested these documents. She requested these documents. She spoke with dozens of people. Most asked to remain anonymous, and it links to their policy about when they allow anonymous sources. She then submitted detailed questions to Giuliani, most of the questions he declined to answer. So, just showing when you think about that people's assumption of what might motivate a story like this, or what might go into the reporting of a story like this, we cannot assume that they have any idea about that. So showing sort of the thorough process is going to lend credibility to the work. So we've definitely found that a common strategy newsrooms we work with like to use is either an editor's note or a box in the story or next to a story, offering these sort of like, here's why we did this story, or here's how we did this story sort of information.
And so in addition to, talking about sources and what information you use and who you interview, definitely talk about your process and then your goals and coverage. So around election coverage, people might have a lot of questions about like why you are covering particular candidates more, particular issues that people will be voting on more, why you are maybe covering, maybe instances, or it seems like something that's inside baseball, right? That might be between two campaigns. So talking about why you are covering the story is super important. And that's what they did here. They talked about why they watch how campaigns are waged, but also talk about your overall strategy. Like, when are you going to cover if someone comes into town to give a speech, or maybe now because of COVID, they're not coming into town, but they're doing something over Zoom. Are you going to show that live? Are you going to, show it on your live stream? Talk about all of that and how it compares to maybe what you used to do, or how it's different from what you used to do. So talking about those goals and processes on top of sourcing.
There are a lot of ways to show that you work to be fair. One really dramatic way is by designing the print edition in a way that shows parallel coverage. So this is from the Atlanta Journal-Constitution, and when they had impeachment verdicts from the House and the Senate, they actually included this box that showed up on their front page, showing that they had used basically the same layout the last time around. The little box says, to ensure our impeachment coverage continues to be balanced, we use the same format on the front page and A7 for the Senate vote as we did on the House vote December 18th. That invites sort of a level of scrutiny that is it's, this is a very tangible piece of evidence. But we've also had things like this, messages like this get through when it comes to, last week we went deep with this stakeholder, today we're going deep with this stakeholder, or that, as Lynn was saying about covering political rallies, one TV station we worked with wrote something about how they're going to handle it when candidates come to town. When the news director went on air and explained that, and then they have something they can link back to each time that says, remember, we told you we would be consistent in how we covered this. We invite you to hold us accountable for that consistency.
Also talking about your ethics, and we every day with coverage are making a bunch of decisions related to ethical decisions about the coverage. And so, are you explaining those decisions, and then are you talking about them? This is an example from the Atlanta Journal-Constitution, and they, when before the legislative session began, they wrote a column about how they're going to cover the legislative session, and they specifically pointed out how we work to be fair. And they, what I really like about this, though, is the last paragraph. They say, our scrutiny of elected officials is not based on personal political views or preferences, but on our responsibility to make sure Georgians know what their leaders are doing and how their tax money is spent. And this is my favorite sentence. As a team of professionals, we hold each other accountable for being even-handed and fair. Even just saying that is something that people may not assume. People don't necessarily know that journalists follow ethical codes, right? Whether that's something that you follow from national organizations or your own, right? You have these codes. So talk about it. Talk about how you follow these codes, what they are, and how they then drive and guide your coverage.
I have a few things to say about the topic of opinion coverage and news coverage. We know that people don't always know what they're getting. We know that of all the ways to consume journalism, there are many, many pitfalls that the public faces when trying to discern whether content is designed to persuade them of something or inform them of something. We know that it's a big problem in the cable news universe, where you turn on the TV and you're not sure who's talking. Is this a journalist? Is it an analyst? Is it a source? It can be very, very hard to tell. But it is also hard to tell in other media as well. So here's an example of doing it well from the New York Times. When you pulled up this editorial from the New York Times, this example on the left is what it looks like on the website. There's an opinion label at the top. The byline says by the editorial board. And if you link to that, there's a long description of what the editorial board does and who's on it. But there also is a 2-sentence version that shows up at the top of the story page. The editorial board is a group of opinion journalists whose views are informed by expertise, research, debate, and certain longstanding values. It is separate from the newsroom, which is something we assume people know. Something that is not always true, actually. There are places where people in the newsroom also sit on the editorial board. We don't have universal standards here. We use confusing language. Editorial is also the name of the editorial department, is also the newsroom in a lot of cases. And yet we somehow think that when people see the editorial board that they automatically know what that means. So the nice thing here is that when this link is pasted onto Facebook, you get what you see on the right, where that opinion kicker above the headline actually migrates to the front of the headline. So as people are scrolling through their Facebook feed, you can see, the word case closed, that's clearly making a judgment, right? It's not just purely there to inform. And so the label is there. One thing we know is that there are plenty of times where there is inappropriate opinion in news coverage, where the lines are blurred in a way that makes it really tricky. And it makes your jobs more difficult because not all news outlets are responsible, and because people don't pay that much attention to where something is coming from. And they might be tuned into a product that is designed, that is based on opinion. And that all to them feels like this, this mass media problem. So sometimes they're right that there's too much opinion in news coverage, or too much opinion in things that look like news coverage. And other times we are just not super clear about what content is designed to do. So here's an example of what it looks like when we're not super clear. Last summer, the Baltimore Sun had a really powerful editorial responding to something the president had said about Baltimore, about how there were rats in the sewer in Baltimore or something. And the headline of their editorial was "Better to have a few rats than to be one." And the editorial circulated far and wide. They got a lot of acclaim for the wording and the strong stance they were taking. However, look at how another journalist, Jim Acosta, when he tweeted this, he said, "Baltimore Sun responds to Trump." You'll notice in the link preview here, that nowhere in that link preview and chatter does the word opinion appear. This looks like the Baltimore Sun as an organization has an adversarial relationship with the president. There's no way this did any favors to the political reporters of the Baltimore Sun, who would like very much not to be seen as if they have a combative relationship. A relationship of accountability, you bet, but not a combative relationship. They're not going to respond to the president in this way. So it is confusing to us at Trusting News that as an industry, we still allow our work to be consumed in an environment that is murky around what is news and what is opinion. So just one more example of what it should look like. We are of the opinion that opinion is the clearest word, that opinion content should have the word opinion : at the front of each headline, that even words like column or letter to the editor are not as clear as they need to be. We just need to go further than that.
And so when we're talking about building transparency and credibility elements into your work, how that can look, I know Joy hinted at that, talking about using an explain your process box. That's something that we have called it here at Trusting News, but some of our newsrooms have called it many different things. And we did some research around this actually, we tested some stories that, one story that had the explain your process box and then the same story that didn't. And what we found is that the stories that had those explain your process boxes boosted people's perception of the news organization on 11 of the 12 items related to trust. So again, when in the USA Today and the Tennessean, which are the newsrooms that we did some A/B testing with this, the stories that had that explain your process box, people found that the news organization was more informative, trusted, credible, had more integrity, more fair, more transparent, more reliable, more accurate, unbiased, and felt that they told the whole story, versus those that saw the story without the explain your process box. So it's something that can be super easy to implement. Some people build it into their CMS. Sometimes people answer one question: how you did the story, why you did the story. Some people answer 2 or 3 questions. And if you don't have the capability in your CMS, we've also seen people just basically create a JPEG or create an image and embed that just like you would with any other photo. And here's another example. This is what the McClatchy explain your process box looks like. They call it behind our reporting. And what's neat about theirs is they have built it into the CMS. And so when you see it in the story, you just see this first question here. Why did we report on the story? But then it's a collapsible box. So when you click on it, then you see all these other questions that are answered here as well. And so it doesn't take up that much room. It doesn't take up that much room in the story, but if people want more information, they can click on it to get more of that information. Where else can these behind the story messages go? Again, those are kind of examples of in print or online. We've also tested it with some newsrooms to do it on air. You can share them on social posts. You can put some of this in comments. We've seen people use it in newsletters. You can do it as an editor's note. You could do it as a column sitting by itself and linking to it. And those are kind of what people might behind the story explainers that you might see produced. And just kind of in closing, who is going to address these gaps and explain how we do our jobs? If it's not journalists, then who? No one's going to kind of be our explainers and share what we do. So yes, it takes time, but we really believe that as an industry, we have to take this on because we're not going to just automatically earn trust for producing trustworthy journalism. And so just some closing things here, and then we'll get to some questions. We do have a newsletter that we encourage you to sign up for. We also do have a free election, a trusted election course that's done through text message. So you can sign up for that there. Basically, once you sign up for 10 days, you'll get messages about how to build trust in your election coverage. And then we also have tons of resources through our partners at Hearken through Election SOS. So there are some resources there, and I'm going to stop sharing my screen here and open it up if there are any questions. It looks like the chat was kind of busy while we were going.
Yeah, we got a couple here. So let's just start near the top. We have Kim McLaren, who says she's not a journalist, but she is a news junkie. I find it very concerning that around 45% of Americans get their news from Facebook, and a lot of it is radical. How can journalists fight back in a really active way against that? I feel like that's general. That's a pretty general question. Is there anything in particular you wanted to touch on in terms of the sourcing of where people get their news and encouraging them to be a little bit more thorough?
Yeah, so that we talk about at Trusting News, or just some tips for, I guess, if for news consumers, is one, always look at the source. If you see something that you're like, wow, this seems really crazy, or I'm not seeing this reported anywhere else, that's like a red flag always. So I always just recommend Googling it, going to search for it, see if others are reporting it. Look at, you know, again, when you're looking at the source, look at the web address. See if you can, when you're on their homepage, do they have information about who they are, who their journalists are? Do they have contact information? Look to see, are they just quoting, is the story just kind of quoting other news organizations or other people, and they're not really saying that it doesn't show that they did their own reporting? If so, that's also a red flag. They might just be aggregating the content, which could also be problematic in some cases. There are also fact-checking websites that are out there that I would highly recommend going to as well if you're curious, is this true, is this not? Specifically on social media, if you do get your news from social media, I think that's fine. I do as well too, but just know that you're only getting what the algorithm sends you. So do make sure to look outside of that as well. Go to your local news website once in a while, to their homepage, to kind of see what else is out there and what else is being covered.
Thank you.
One thing we think we really advise local newsrooms to do is be a resource for this sort of news literacy. Like, you can earn trust by helping your audience navigate the news. And people don't understand how the Facebook algorithm works. They really genuinely don't realize that what they follow and what they engage with determines what they see, and just how different your Facebook experience can be. And so we really advise journalists to think through how they might help people make the news landscape less overwhelming for people, and just sort of educate them about the choices they make and how that affects the view they have on the world.
Machine, you had a question. Did you want to just ask that since you're unmuted?
All right. So my question is, what do you think, what would be the biggest challenge for the media during upcoming presidential elections when it comes to the credibility of the reporting?
Well, one thing we are especially worried about with this particular election is that we're likely to face a lack of definitive answers, and the sense that things are chaotic in a way that is not usual for us. Journalists don't feel comfortable living in that ambiguity. We like answers. We like to tell people what we know. And there's a real danger that we will hypothesize, that we will work so hard to find something to say that we'll say things we don't feel confident in, that we will highlight sort of the chaos because it makes for interesting, the sort of background and the back and forth and the drama of it all makes for interesting stories, but could leave people with the feeling that things are even more chaotic than they actually are. Where one of our newsroom partners this morning at WITF in Pennsylvania sent a link to a box they've started to put with a bunch of election stories that just says, remember, be patient when you look for results, because we're likely not to have results, and here's why, and the percentage of mail-in ballots, and just sort of preparing audiences for the fact that things are not going to look the way that we're used to them looking, and that doesn't necessarily, that might be expected. It doesn't necessarily mean that things have gone terribly wrong. And so I think a real challenge that we're trying to coach journalists through, that I'm concerned about, is whether they will able to adapt their priorities and their storytelling and which stories they're trying to tell, adapt that enough to help their audiences make sense of it.
Thank you. Okay, so we have another one from Kim here. She says, with everyone so divided these days, who does the best job of bridging an MSNBC and a Fox? It seems like everyone is more comfortable listening and reading to the same point of view / news over and over again.
Well, one thing we definitely know is that people claim bias when they don't agree with something. So if you agree with Rachel Maddow and you're watching Rachel Maddow, you're not watching Rachel and saying, "Oh, that's so biased," right? It feels right to you. You say that you accuse something of bias if it's not, doesn't conform to your worldview. So people are not always smart about whether what they're getting is straight ahead journalism or whether it conforms to, whether it's, they're confirming their existing bias. And so I think it's we mostly coach local newsrooms, and I think it's really important for local newsrooms to stay out of that fray when they can, and to say, we know that you can get your news in a lot of different places. What we hope you turn to us for is this, and here's what our commitment is.
And then the last one from, Lynn, did you want to?
Yeah, I was just going to say, I think somewhat, like I don't have cable at home, and so I rely on a lot of apps and streaming services. And just plugging CBSN, I think they do a really good job. It's a free service. It's less of the talking heads and kind of more context. That's one just kind of TV organization that I would recommend for some unbiased coverage. And again, I think also local news coverage definitely is going to, I think, probably have the best coverage for some of this when you're looking at your local issues and when you're not looking for stuff that's biased.
It seems to me that a lot of time when people talk, at least when I've spoken to people about when they're complaining about biased news, it seems like often what they really seem to be saying or mean to say is nonpartisan news. They're looking for nonpartisan. They don't want a bunch of hacks who are towing the party line, or even more so, they want principled coverage. They want something that has a set of, I mean, you talked about posting about the ethics, structures that newsrooms operate as. Do you find that as well? Do you find the term, biased coverage to be, problematic in any way? And if you could talk a little bit about that and the difference between sort of adopting this view from nowhere perspective, especially when it comes to issues of human rights or, whether people deserve dignity, and trying to balance that versus what I think most people really are looking for. Like I said, it was a principled, nonpartisan approach to information as opposed to non-biased.
Principled is a really good word. I like that a lot. I'm going to add that to my list. People say they want balanced coverage, and we're always trying to dig down deeper at what that means.
Yeah.
Because it doesn't mean equal airtime for different views, right? Fairness, I think principled is good. Like basically, I think what people are looking for is the idea that you'll go where the facts lead you, that you're not bringing into an agenda that you're trying to hide. People are actually okay with you coming from a place if you're transparent about where that is. So people will tell us, I don't mind getting my news from Christian radio because I know where they're coming from. And so I think that, if you stand on the side of human rights and dignity, then say that. We have some great examples of mission statements that say pretty clearly where someone's coming from. I think that, digging deeper into what people mean by that is tricky and very important. And a lot of times it gets down to sort of what the goals are of your work. And so where you can actually just say that, it can be really beneficial.
Thank you. We have about 1 minute left, and we've had a couple from Kim already, but that's the only one I haven't gotten to. Just to, if you could maybe talk a little bit more about, whether or not you believe newspapers should endorse candidates at all, what your thoughts are on endorsements, what role they play, what value they serve or need they fill, or don't.
Coming from a TV background, I'm not as someone who has kind of grown up with working somewhere where there's been an organization that has endorsed someone. And so personally, I think right now in the information landscape, I think it can be way more confusing, and maybe sometimes it makes it harder for the news consumer to kind of separate those opinion and those endorsements from the actual coverage itself. So I think it can be potentially more harmful just in the landscape that we use, specifically for your online audience, your social audience. I think in print, it's a lot easier to decipher, okay, here's the opinion section, right? And it's gonna have also the cartoons, all of that kind of stuff, right? It's easier to decipher then. So I think specifically when it comes to online stuff, to me, don't see necessarily a real reason or a place for it. That's for me personally. And I think it can be more confusing. I also think it can be done responsibly though, but we don't see everyone doing that. So it leads to more problems.
I stuck in the chat one example from the San Francisco Chronicle where they just do a good job. If you're going to do it, at least outline what you're trying to achieve, what your organization's history with that, why you think it's important, and exactly how it is connected to or separate from the decisions made around the news coverage. Who was in the room? A lot of times the editorial boards will say, we invited our political reporters to sit in, but they didn't ask any questions, like this was not their process. Just being real clear about how that works. And then every single time you refer to it or link to it, make sure there's language that explains that process as well.
Thank you so much. We are at the top of the hour now, so I will, in the interest of time, we're going to end it here. But Joy, Lynn, thank you so much, both of you, for your time and for your insight. We will be providing the link to the recording to this session to anyone who registered. So keep an eye out for that. As soon as it's done processing, I'll go ahead and we'll send that around, as well as a roundup of any of the links and important information that Joy and Lynn have graciously shared with us. You can check out Trusting News. We're going to put the link to their website. We're going to put their Twitter bios and everything in their Twitter handles in the email, so you can get in touch with them and follow their work. Anything else you'd like to plug, Joy, Lynn? Anything before we go?
No, I don't think so. Thank you so much, everyone, for your time today.
Yes, thank you so much.
All right. Thanks, folks. We will end it there. Take care.